Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to my YouTube channel or website if that's where you're coming from. In case you haven't seen my intro video, quick intro is that my name is Alistair Taylor. I have a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the Hawaii School of Professional Psychology, which is an American Psychological Association accredited school since 1998. And this site is really all about trying to share and communicate some of the things that I've learned mostly from the fields of cognitive and affective neuroscience and biological bases of human behavior, which are probably my two main interests. And I'm going to be doing a series of informational and educational videos on a wide range of topics, mostly related to overall physiological and psychological well-being. But this particular one is going to be slightly different, and it's my first video on this sort of series, I guess you could say, so might be a little choppy as I work on my presentation skills, but this is actually going to be a summary overview of my dissertation work. Was thinking that dissertations are a lot of work. They take several years to put together in a lot of instances, and mine certainly did, 2 or 3 year project, and it's kind of a shame because a lot of times they just sort of disappear into a dark closet in the internet somewhere, and they're not often capitalized on for their utility and potential usefulness to others. So I thought it might be helpful to share what I worked on my own dissertation, and also hopefully for graduate students, whether you're in psychology or not, maybe an overview of what a dissertation defense looks like. And these slides and the topics that I'll be discussing here, the content I'll be discussing, is essentially a slightly modified version of my dissertation defense. So with that being said, I'm going to just dive in and give an explanation. And this was the title of my dissertation: A Licensed Naturopathic Doctor's Perspectives on the Etiology and Treatment of Autism Spectrum Disorder. So it was focused on autism, but it was, although the literature review segment of the dissertation focused heavily on autism, the message around the dissertation itself was exploring how a naturopathic physician conceptualizes the etiology and treatment and mechanisms of change in autism, as contrasted with the typical standard of care model in most developed nations. So I'll explain further as I go along. Thank you of course, to all my friends and family that helped make this possible, my faculty that supported me, and yeah, I said that in my dissertation defense. I just feel like I need to say it again. So in terms of why I picked this topic, this is actually, I'm not going to just read from slides, but I'm going to make an exception here, because this is a brief extract from my abstract, and abstracts are very carefully worded because you have a very limited word count, about 250 words, and you've got to summarize an entire dissertation. It's really hard to cherry pick your words any more succinctly than what I have here. So this is an extract from that, and I'll just read it out. So the objective of this qualitative study is to explore, using the transcendental phenomenological method, the understandings and meaning making of a licensed naturopathic doctor's experiences in treating children with neurodevelopmental disabilities using complementary alternative medicine. This may help shed new light in the practice of integrated psychology that could aid in the differential diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, develop a broader understanding of the etiology of ASD and mechanisms of change in treatment, and aid in improving consultation and collaboration with other healthcare providers. So just to take the really zoomed out view, the 30,000 foot view, I guess you could say, it's not specifically an in-depth study of autism. It does deal with it a lot in the literature review, but it's not specifically the focus of the study. It's more understanding how a naturopath approaches autism, because they come from a very different model than the conventional medical model. So I'll be talking about that. It's an exploration of what contributes to the development of autism and how it is differentially conceptualized and treated in these two different camps of medical practice. It is definitely not an attempt to foster an us versus them mentality. So I'm not trying to pit one camp against the other, say one is better than the other. I think they both have their limitations, and they both have their benefits. And it's also, of course, because I come from a background of psychology, it's like, well, how can the practice or the discipline of psychology benefit from CAM approaches? And I think this is relevant because, well, at least in my school, having been an APA accredited school, we kind of go by a curriculum that is concordant with what the APA requires, and that, you could double the length of grad school basically and still never cover everything you need to know about psychology, let alone complementary alternative approaches. So this is something that I feel is like maybe underappreciated in conventional or traditional psychology schools, and I wanted to bring some attention and awareness to this topic. So what's going on is that the prevalence of autism appears to be increasing. No one seems to know exactly why. I think the causes are multifactorial. And another thing is that there's this sort of schism between the standard of care model, conventional medicine, and the complementary alternative medical model on how autism is conceptualized, how people think about it, what autism means, how it's diagnosed, and certainly how it's treated, and what yields change, the process of change. So this is a graph from the California Department of Developmental Services tracking data from about 1984 till 2008, and you can see there's a pretty rapid uptick in cases. Granted, this is just one state, but it's probably reflective of most of the world, or at least developed nations. So yeah, you can see the incidence and prevalence of autism has been increasing quite dramatically. And I don't think there's much dispute as to the fact that it's increasing. The other alternative explanation is that there's more awareness of autism and more testing being done, therefore more diagnosis. But the overall consensus view is that the numbers are probably increasing, along with these other sort of, I guess you could say, sometimes comorbid or sometimes distinctly different, but related disorders such as attention deficit ADHD. Sorry, got tongue twisted there. So this is what the CDC have to say about autism, and this, of course, there's other sources that you could look at that are, I guess, government-sanctioned approaches, spokespeople for the government, medical agencies, and so on. But CDC encapsulates a lot of that type of thinking with respect to the medical model and evidence-based treatment, and they describe autism treatment as primarily behavior and communication, dietary approaches, and medication, and then CAM approaches. The view on complementary alternative medicine by the CDC appears to be somewhat reserved or skeptical in some ways. It's very much a cautious sort of approach. And in terms of dietary interventions, it's definitely not indicating resounding support. I think they're trying to be somewhat neutral, but I think it also comes across as somewhat critical. So they list only one study when I cited the source at this time, although that was a systematic review, so it included 19 RCTs, randomized control trials. And this is where the sort of, I guess, somewhat pessimistic viewpoint comes in, that they found little evidence to support the use of dietary treatments of children with autism. So, in the course of putting a dissertation together, I reviewed like so many hundreds of journal articles, more than I could possibly remember. And I think journal articles are tricky because you have to really kind of take them one at a time and scour them with rigorous detail to understand whether it was a well-designed study, if it was methodologically flawed. There's just countless reasons as to why a study or a journal article may not accurately answer the research question. So just as one example, I picked out one from the study quoted by the CDC, and they talked about the study that was done on using fish oil supplementation, so essential fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids, to treat autism. And they found these sort of ambiguous results that didn't seem to indicate strong benefit or any benefit. And this is an example, I think, of where the nuance comes in, because when I looked at the study, I would try to find out where they sourced out their fish oil from, and it was a commercial operation that sells purified fish oil, which is preferable to many consumers because not many people like the idea of maybe gutting a fish and sucking the oil out of it. It probably wouldn't taste that great, and that's, I think, well, I know what pure fish oil tastes like because I have my own source that I use for myself that is entirely unprocessed, and it literally tastes like very oily fish. Doesn't taste great, especially for little kids. But if you buy most of these commercial brands of fish oil, you'll see that they are marketed as being either flavored or deodorized, and that processing, while it might appear innocuous, and they market it as being safe and not altering the composition of the fish oil itself, I don't think that's necessarily accurate and true. The thing about omega-3 fatty acids is that their chemical makeup is, I guess you could describe it as very delicate, fragile, easily damaged. And the way fatty acids work in the body, they play a variety of essential functions, but omega-3s in particular, with their delicate structure, they are critical to cell membrane fluidity and integrity and the shape of the cell membrane. So if you look at a cell and you imagine it a little bit like a beach ball or something, but probably more like a beach ball that has those little tiny little spines on it that maybe make the ball easier to grip. And if you could think of the shape of the ball as influencing the way those little spines project outwards from the spherical shape, those little spines would be analogous to the receptors on a cell membrane wall, and there are thousands of those on every cell. Those are receptors for neurotransmitters, so the neurotransmitter has a site to bind to communicate with the cell. For things like insulin, so insulin can bind to the receptor and allow glucose to enter the cell, and so on. So there's thousands of these things, but if you can imagine taking the ball and then kind of squeezing and distorting it in some way so it wasn't a spherical shape anymore, and maybe it was kind of this weird sort of, well, some pliable shape, it would also alter the way those receptors project into their environment, and whether the ligands in the environment, those things like insulin, for example, are able to bind to that receptor. Because if it's nice and plump and round, the insulin kind of comes along and there's the nice round shape and it docks on to the cell membrane or the receptor. But if the receptor is some way not correctly aligned with the environment, maybe because the cell itself is disfigured, it's almost like, I guess you could think of the way flowers grow out of the ground, and they sort of just grow straight up and they reach out as if it were towards the sunlight, trying to optimize their exposure to sun so they can engage in photosynthesis and so on. But if the ground was such, or the plant was such, that it was growing in this sort of like weird U-turn shape and maybe reaching back down onto the ground, some sort of disfigured shape like that, it wouldn't optimally be able to receive sunlight. So it's a complicated thing to explain, but essentially fatty acids play a very crucial role in the way the cell membrane is arranged and the way that the receptors are aligned. They're embedded in the cell membrane and they project out into the environment, the extracellular space, and that reads the environment and interacts with the environment. So it's sort of like these things that are almost like spaceships docking on the International Space Station or so, and there has to be that correct alignment for those things to take place. And essential fatty acids, just as a bit of a tangent, they also play pretty important roles in things like immune function, because many of these inflammatory and anti-inflammatory compounds in the body are derived from either omega-3 or omega-6 fatty acids. So that's a really quick overview. It's a complex topic, but the thing is that processing these things can damage the shape of the molecule. And I would actually say a good resource for further discussion on this, one of the guys I like to follow in the world of nutrition is Chris Masterjohn. I think his website is chrismasterjohnphd.com. Gives a much better description of this thing than I do. And he describes fatty acids almost like glass, which glass is very functional in our environment. Like we have glass windows and we drink out of glass cups, so on, drink out of glasses. glasses we might wear on our face for correcting vision. All of those things are very useful, but broken glass, on the other hand, is like pretty dangerous. Like, can cause a lot of damage, and the more broken glass you have lying around, the more dangerous it is. And fatty acids, when in their damaged form, are potentially analogous to how glass can be damaging too. They can have this sort of effect of interacting with other molecules, and in a manner that is similar to oxidative stress, and sets off this sort of propagation chain reaction of damaging the entire cell membrane. Also trying to think of like just an example to make this clear is like, wasn't that long ago when I think the FDA banned the use of trans fats, and one of the reasons I believe that happened was that it was implicated in pathogenesis of diabetes, which is interesting because fats per se are not really typically the driver of diabetes. It's normally a lot of sugar in the diet. So it's kind of weird that trans fats were causing all these problems in the body, but it makes sense if you think that if trans fats with their sort of dysfunctional, unnatural shape are incorporated into the cell membrane is now kind of like I was just talking about, it's not functioning the way it's intended to, it's not supposed to, and the receptors therefore are also not reading the environment the way they should. And if a receptor and the ligand are not interacting in the correct way, so for example, if insulin cannot dock with the insulin receptor, glucose cannot get into the cell, and then now you have a problem of like high blood sugar, which, you know, I don't want to go too much into that, but that would be like the hallmark of diabetes. So fats play a very critical role in like a number of aspects of neurological function, because they're such critical components of cell membranes, including neurons, and their role in mediating inflammation and just all the other processes in the body that relate to cellular communication. So anyway, just back to this study, it's basically just saying that fish oil, you know, if you use these commercial brands, it may account for why they found these sort of ambiguous or ineffective results in using it to treat autism. If they were using the real thing, or maybe it was just like feeding kids Atlantic wild-caught salmon, highly pure, that type of delivery of omega-3 fatty acids, I think the outcome might have been different. But these types of interventions where you use something that's processed can actually potentially aggravate the problem. So long story short is what the CDC say in quote is not necessarily accurate. Or journals in general. You got to kind of always look a little bit deeper. So, yeah, just in summary, taking a fish oil supplement thus may be vastly different than a whole fatty fish consumption. Could even be harmful. Another thing is, another layer to this too, is that food, when it's a supplement from a food, seems to behave slightly differently than eating the whole food matrix itself. There's other studies that have indicated, like research on these compounds like sulforaphane and quercetin. So sulforaphane is a compound that is found, for example, in like broccoli, certain other vegetables. It's a sulfur containing compound, and then quercetin, which is often found in things like apple and grape skin. And there's not tons of studies on these because I think these compounds are difficult to isolate in meaningful quantities, but they do seem to indicate a lot of health benefits. However, when you compare them to a study where it just looks at eating broccoli or eating apples, it's like the broccoli or apples themselves seem to be more beneficial. So it's really just looking at the whole food complex seems to be better than the isolated nutrient itself. And that's another limitation of studies looking at like supplements. So this was the literature review, and it was essentially comparing and contrasting psychology and naturopathic medicine, so we could understand this viewpoint of this naturopathic doctor I was working with here in Hawaii. And she was kind enough to provide her data, treatment outcome data from children with autism. And these are the main principles of naturopathic medicine. They try to work with the healing power of nature, identifying and treating causes rather than focusing on symptoms. First, do no harm. That's actually comparable and parallel, I think, to medicine in general. Treating the whole person rather than the identified complaint. The doctor fulfilling the role as a teacher, which is actually what doctor actually means. That it's, I don't know how many people are aware of that, but doctor comes from the Latin word doctore, to teach. And then focus on prevention, which I think is also critical and something I admire about that approach. Prevention's a lot easier to deal with than something 10 years later when all the collateral damage is kind of lumped in there. And so naturopathic medicine does have some similarities to the practice of psychology. If you look at, for example, person-centered therapy, which places the client, as it were, as the sort of expert. They're expert on their own experience, and you just sort of help them discover what their self-actualizing tendencies are. It's kind of in there. You just got to help them bring it out. Cognitive behavioral therapy includes a strong psychoeducational component. If you look at dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, it also incorporates a pretty holistic approach. You know, how do you use and capitalize on sleep and exercise and diet and relationships as part and parcel of your overall well-being. Psychology places huge emphasis on the doctor-patient relationship. The biopsychosocial model, that also places a lot of emphasis on the environment rather than pathologizing the person with the condition or the complaint, and recognizing how much the environment may be driving that disorder. Also, just an excerpt from the APA's own website, that the role of psychologists is critical in advocating for human health at a practical level, at all levels. And also somewhat related in that even our APA accredited programs, we have credits on, full semester credits on biological bases of behavior and psychopharmacology. So those are, I guess, more intro level, but they're as deep as you want to take them. It's just time constraints, I guess, that limit how much you can dig into those. But those were certainly some of my key interests, and I spent a lot of time on those. So looking at the etiology, what causes autism? And there is no known single cause. There are probably just a multifactorial range of causes. Another example of that, for example, there I go, repeating myself. The incidence is higher in monozygotic or identical twins, but it's seldom 100%. So if it was purely a genetic disorder, we would expect identical twins to both carry the condition, and this is often not the case. So there's likely a genetic component, but it does not account for the large increase in prevalence over time. This is just basically due to the stability of genes. So, genes tend to be very stable across multiple generations, and then it would be kind of weird over the course of human history for this rapid uptick, like that graph indicated, just in the last maybe 30 years, this massive jump in cases. It doesn't seem like that would be entirely driven by genes. So epigenetics may offer a better explanation, and that's the exploration of how genes and environment interact with each other. And the naturopathic position is similar to this, and some medical doctors endorse this too, that it's just multifactorial. There's probably many moving parts, many contributing factors, and it's not necessarily what you might term neurological. I say that in the context of thinking of autism as something that exists explicitly in the brain. It may incorporate many other bodily or physical systems. So in terms of the mechanisms of change, the standard of care model posits that it's mediated primarily by behavioral intervention and medical management of irritability. So if your child is diagnosed with autism, you may be referred to applied behavior analysis, ABA behavior modification strategies, and a psychiatrist may work with you for prescription of some antipsychotic medication to help. Actually, there's no real medication that's indicated for autism specifically. These other medications are prescribed off-label, meaning they're intended for something else, but they're meant to reduce the symptoms of autism, not autism itself. So Pharmacology is kind of stuck on this one, to be quite honest. So anyway, behavior may be modified or improved by modifying antecedents and the consequences of behavior, and I'm not questioning that. I think ABA has definite utility. I'll talk about the limitations later, but this may lead to more pro-social behavior, and that reciprocally influences the child's environment in a positive manner. And then medications can definitely help reduce symptoms of irritability. I'm not questioning that either. The CAM approach is that at least the one with the naturopathic physician that I worked with, she was looking at biomarkers that are out of sight of the normal reference range, indicating disturbances in natural and essential biological processes, and then it looks to replace what is missing, so the nature's healer principle can be actualized. And then it looks beyond symptoms and investigates the causes of dysfunction. And another important part is that CAM is not like a standalone practice. It's complementary, means that it works alongside with. It's not substitution for. So this physician that I was working with, for example, she collaborates with neurologists, psychologists, medical doctors, psychiatrists, and so on. And I think that integrative approach can be very, very effective. It's just that CAM approaches are the ones that are very often left out. My own sort of summary interpretation of that is that the standard of care approach is like trying to fix the problem. The other one is really trying to allow nature to direct its own healing process if you remove the obstacles to healing. So these are the two medications that are FDA approved for the symptoms of autism. No, it's not for the treatment of autism, symptoms only. And they are prescribed. This review that I looked at was estimating about 47% of children with autism. It's quite a lot. These medications are pretty effective. The problem is that they can be very sedating, to the point, in my own personal experience with working some of these children, is that they're so sedated that they're not very receptive to new learning. So that's a bit of an issue. You want to control the irritability, but you don't want them to be zombies either. And they just can't respond, like they're just too checked out to really respond to new behavioral modification. So this is not every kid. Some respond well to medication. It's maybe a titration issue. Dose makes the poison, as it were. Another problem is that many of them have moderate to rapid weight gain. That is a significant issue because these are children we're talking about, and for some of them they do gain a lot of weight, and weight gain can contribute to other things like lethargy and fatigue and lack of energy and metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease. It often, unfortunately, goes in tandem with this preference that a lot of autistic children with autism appear to have, that they crave kind of processed food. It's a texture, flavor type of thing, and they sometimes are very resistant to eating healthy food. So unfortunately they gravitate towards a diet that also exacerbates this weight gain issue and other issues that I'll talk about later on. And then some of these medications also seem to raise inflammatory processes like elevated levels of C-reactive protein. I'm not sure on the mechanism of action there, but that is anything that engenders further inflammation is a problem, and especially when inflammation itself is already implicated in autism. So we'll explore further on that too. So this is one of the key concepts in this study, is the methylation cycle, and this is an expanded view of what the methylation cycle looks like. I know you can't see it super well on the screen. I'm not going to delve into this too much because this is above my pay grade, and I'm not an expert on methylation. I studied it to the extent that it was useful for my dissertation. I talked to the physician that I was working with on the study, and she seemed to communicate that I had a pretty good grasp of it. This is the simplified version that I will discuss briefly, because I want this to be practical and meaningful. So the methylation cycle is this process wherein your body has a molecule called S-adenosyl methionine, also colloquially known as SAM-E, SAM-E, which is a compound that is natural in our bodies, and it donates a methyl group. So a methyl group is chemically written out as CH3. It's a carbon with 3 hydrogen atoms attached to it. And I'm going to try to explain this in a way that is just practical and sensible. It might get a little technical, but I guess what you could think of when you methylate something, SAMe is donating the methyl group that's on the SAMe, and it's donating it onto an acceptor molecule. And when a molecule receives another molecule on it, you could almost think about it like Legos might be an example. If you construct pieces of Lego, you build something, right? And you change the shape of it. A more specific metaphor might be a key. Like if you look at a key that opens your door and you either add or remove one of the notches on the key, it probably won't open that door anymore. It might open a door somewhere else, who knows where, but it's not going to serve the function that it originally had before that shape change. So methylation is when you add a methyl group to an acceptor molecule. That acceptor molecule may be a neurotransmitter, for example, and it alters the function of the neurotransmitter. So it's altering, in a sense, directly maybe human behavior and thinking and emotion. If you add a methyl group to DNA, you change it in such a way that the DNA becomes unreadable. So you cannot transcribe it. And then if you remove the methyl group from the DNA can be read, it can be transcribed. So that's the very brief overview of what methylation is and what it does, but it's involved in hundreds or thousands of processes in the body that it also is involved in, so like gene expression, gene silencing, detoxification pathways, neurotransmitter synthesis, degradation, the building of the cell membrane, which I was talking about a little bit earlier. Methylation plays a pretty important role in that too. I'm probably forgetting many of the important purposes it serves, but for this purpose of my study, it was really to look at like how does it affect gene expression and neurotransmitter levels and detoxification pathways. Those were the three main ones. And then an overview too of how it works. So we have methionine, dietary protein coming in from the diet. Methionine, of course, is one of many amino acids, 20 or whatever they are. Methionine is this one that comes in. Pretty sure, if I remember right, methionine is the key primary amino acid every time a protein is synthesized in the body. So if your DNA expresses a gene and it encodes a protein and your body builds that protein, methionine is the number one amino acid on that chain. So methionine is like, I can't say it's more important than other amino acids, but it's super important where methylation is concerned. And so methionine comes in. I would just add as a little side note here, methionine is far more abundant in animal protein than it is in plant protein. This could be a reason why some people struggle with vegetarian or vegan diets. I'm definitely not criticizing those diets as a way of eating. I think there's a good way, there's a right way and a wrong way to eat any kind of diet, right? But I'm just saying that this is maybe one of the potential caveats where people struggle, is that they're just having a hard time getting enough methionine in the diet. So methionine then interacts with ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. That's basically the energy currency of the body. If you look at this in terms of like the overall synergistic like value of this whole system, ATP is dependent on so many processes before it even becomes ATP. For example, ATP is molecularly bound to magnesium. So if you don't have magnesium, you can be ATP deficient. And there are estimates that most people in the US, for example, are magnesium deficient. I'm not sure on the statistical number and the accuracy thereof, but it makes sense because magnesium is most abundant in things like nuts, whole grains, and vegetables. And if you're eating a processed food diet, you're not getting a lot of magnesium. Magnesium also interacts with many other nutrients, so you can't even just view magnesium on its own by itself as like this sort of standalone product. If you look at how ATP is generated, it depends on healthy metabolism, which is dependent on all the B vitamins and iron and delivering oxygen and blood to the cell. So, these things this is why this diagram is like actually vastly oversimplified, and why the topic of nutrient deficiencies is far more complex than what surface value indicates. So anyway, when methionine interacts with ATP, it becomes SAMe. That's that S-adenylyl methionine that is the compound that donates methyl groups. If you go to certain drugstores and Costco, for example, sell SAMe, it's actually a supplement. And it comes with a warning, so I'm definitely not advocating you rush out and try SAMe just for the heck of it. Definitely that's something you work with your doctor on, because the product, even though it's over the counter, it's sold with the warning that like it's not indicated for bipolar disorder, for example. So that's an example of like knowing that this thing has pretty powerful effects, even though it's a natural substance. My personal bias is that if you're going to correct methylation, you probably are better off, even from a financial position, because that stuff is not cheap. Correct your diet, because this is all this complexity. You can't really reduce it into this single variable of whether do I have enough SAMe or not. There's all these other things that play into it, and all these other things fulfill hundreds, if not thousands, of other functions in the body. So it's not just about correcting SAMe levels, it's about correcting all the things that facilitate optimal mental and physical health. So anyway, after SAMe donates its methyl group, it becomes S-adenylyl homocysteine, and then this is the cycle, the methylation cycle, where SAH becomes homocysteine, and it's recycled, hopefully, back into SAMe through the cycle. And this cycle can go via several different pathways. One is this pathway right here, which is dependent on choline, the nutrients choline or betaine. If it goes on this pathway here, it's dependent on vitamin B12, B6, folate, vitamin B2. If you have deficiencies here, you may not be able to recycle the homocysteine, and then homocysteine accumulates. And that homocysteine is also pretty well correlated with inflammatory disorders such as cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's. And these are the things that we test for, or not I test for, but the naturopathic physician I was working with when she treats children with autism, those are the values she's testing for to detect if they are out of range, which would indicate that the cycle is not functioning properly. And then, excuse me. The other pathway that homocysteine can enter is this one right here, the transsulfuration pathway, which the end product is glutathione, these other ones too, but taurine and sulfate also have crucial roles in our health. But glutathione is the body's primary antioxidant defense mechanism. There are other ones such as superoxide dismutase, and then the nutrient versions of antioxidants such as vitamin E and C, and I think selenium plays a role in that. So there's many others, but glutathione is the main defense. And glutathione is typically depleted in chronic disease states, and actually in children with autism as well. Incidentally, I just throw this out there as a point of interest. Somewhere along this sort of COVID-19 journey, I saw, I think, an article, or maybe it was an anecdote of somebody treating their patients with intravenous glutathione, which is a treatment in the complementary alternative medical world. And apparently, I don't know if this was a journal, and I don't know if it was peer reviewed, so take with a pinch of salt, but they were using this intravenous glutathione, and apparently all of the people to whom it was administered recovered rapidly from COVID with no deaths, no major symptoms. So I'm just saying that this is an example of, if you look at something like COVID, where there's this massive immune response, and the role that glutathione plays in mediating immune function, and this sort of this cascade of like intense oxidative stress that often accompanies infection, glutathione plays a massive critical role in dampening that effect. And if you think and consider how it's very likely that, I would say, large numbers of the population in the developed world are deficient in some of these nutrients, and this system is not working as it should, and they may well have deficiencies in glutathione. Also bearing in mind that if you smoke and drink and eat a lot of junk food, and stress too, like those things in and of themselves, even if you have adequate levels of dietary glutathione, will deplete your glutathione levels faster, so you're more vulnerable to health deterioration in that respect. But if you combine that with a nutrient deficient diet, where maybe you're just, not to lambaste vegans, but I mean, if you Maybe if you're B12 deficient, for example, the cycle may not be working optimally. Or even if you eat like a fairly sort of omnivorous diet, but if you're not getting enough folate because you don't eat green leafy vegetables, that may precipitate a deficiency in that area. Some of these enzymes in this process are also zinc dependent, and that's a little bit more, I don't think I have the time to really go into that, but that's another fairly common deficiency. And again, like look at COVID, like zinc plays a pretty critical role in immune function. So maybe that's another reason why COVID has had such a strong stranglehold in developed nations, where modern medicine's great, but people are still not doing well. So what does this really look like at a practical level too, right? So this is the first study that really highlighted the importance of methylation in health. This was a groundbreaking study by Waterland and Girdle in, I forgot the year that it was, it's in my references, but what they did is they had these mice, these are called agouti mice, so they have a gene called the agouti gene. That's AGOUTI if you want to Google that stuff. And these mice are genetically identical, but as you can tell, there's quite a lot of difference between them. And what they did was that they had these agouti mice that are sort of predisposed towards rapid weight gain, and they don't tend to live very long. They are prone to developing diabetes and cancerous tumors. And they took the moms and they fed them a diet. Well, they had one group that received the regular rat chow, and then they had the other group that was supplemented with these nutrients that I just mentioned in the methylation cycle, so choline and B12 and folate and so on. And they put a lot of that in their rat chow, and then the mice gave birth. They had their offspring. So in the standard rat chow group, the mice, being genetically identical to their moms, came out looking just like the mom, kind of this sort of yellow color fur, same trajectory with weight gain and predisposition to an untimely and early end. The ones that had received the methylating nutrients, their offspring, as you can see here, much smaller, not obese, different fur color. Interesting, just how the addition of those nutrients affected the methylation of genes. So certain genes were silenced and other ones may have been expressed that changed the color of the hair. And so the offspring of the methylated nutrient group, they lived about 30-something% longer. None of them developed tumors. None of them developed diabetes. So pretty profound implications. And I think that's another really important consideration for when we look at the etiology of autism. And it's not necessarily what we see and observe in the child. It's what we see in the parents and the parents' parents. These things can go back generationally. Like, I think there's pretty good evidence that stress from World War I, people that were affected by World War I, for example, carries across to the generation we're in now. So there are these transgenerational effects too. And then in terms of like just a really quick overview of oxidative stress, that is a process wherein it's a bit complicated, but just to keep it simple, that atoms have this configuration where they have paired electrons in their outermost orbit, and if an atom is destabilized, it can destabilize the molecule that atom is part of, and if it loses an electron through this process of oxidative stress, this is molecular sort of damage. It's a little bit like the analogy of the glass, right? The glass is a good product, but when it's broken, it's sharp edges everywhere. Another maybe more apt description is iron. Like if you look at iron left out in the environment, initially it may be smooth, you can hold it easily, it may be an object that was crafted out of iron, it's easy to hold, comfortable, but you leave it outdoors for a period of years and the thing gets rusty and you grab it and it will shred your skin, it'll cut you, because that's oxidative damage, right? That's the iron reacting with the oxygen and it's losing electrons at a molecular level, and then the shape is changing and it's becoming this sort of rough sawtooth edge thing. So when an atom loses that electron, it will try to steal an electron from a neighboring atom or molecule to stabilize its own orbit. But that propagates this chain reaction domino-like effect, because now it's now destabilized another molecule, and now that one's got the problem of being destabilized. It's got to in turn steal one from somewhere else, and that's the chain reaction just goes and goes and goes until you can arrest it with antioxidant activity. And how antioxidants work is that they have the capacity to donate an electron without themselves sustaining damage. So glutathione, for example, is a molecule that has numerous electrons available for donation. Vitamin C is another one. So this is part of how you arrest that process of what looks like kind of like physiological rust in the body that damages all kinds of proteins. And if you think about damage to a protein in the body, like I said with the key, once that thing is damaged, the shape is changed, it can't open the door, as it were, to the lock it was designed to open. It's now, in a way, almost useless. And if you multiply that out in the body across millions of proteins that have a specific function, the whole system can start to degrade. And that's actually essentially what aging looks like. Aging is obviously inevitable, but if you look at, for example, especially with identical twins, where one is a smoker and one is not, and you look at them, and the one started smoking at a young age, and you look at a side-by-side comparison of them when they were 20 years old, they look splitting image of each other, and then maybe 50 years later, when one's been smoking a lot, they're still identical twins, and they should look much alike, but the one that's been smoking will often you'll see the signs of accelerated aging, and that's because of the oxidative stress of the cigarette smoke. Roughly speaking, because that's just one example, and there's many different examples of things that, as they listed here, like stress, toxins, chemicals, radiation, many things can contribute to this damage. So if you have good antioxidant status, you can kind of throw the water on the fire, as it were, put the fire out before it does a lot of damage. And then just a quick example of what this can look like. This is an example of myelin in the brain, which is the fatty acid that coats the axons that enable faster transmission of signaling from neuron to neuron. If you look here, I don't know how well it'll come across on your screen, but this is what myelin looks like in a healthy state. It's nicely compacted. And then here you can see it almost looks like it's just disintegrating. And I think this is from multiple sclerosis. But these types of phenomena are also observable in things like Alzheimer's and other neurocognitive disorders and just diseases, chronic disease states. So you can see, and then this is where it's kind of the tissues are almost being ripped apart, as it were, by oxidative stress. So they're just literally disintegrating. And then that has massive implications for how nerves communicate with one another, nerve cells. This is showing microglial activation. So microglia are cells in the brain that act as immune agents, kind of like part of the immune system in the brain. And here you can see before and after. Here they're relatively quiet, and here they're very active. That's indicating an inflammatory response to the oxidative stress. Macrophages also playing a similar role in the brain with clearing up damaged proteins or lipids. They're sort of like the brain's house cleaning and immune cells. And neutrophils and T cells, again, are part of the immune system, and you can see the before and after that they're much more active over here. So this is kind of what oxidative stress may look like in certain degenerative disorders. And then another component to this whole autism riddle is the gut-brain axis. So the brain there's all the emerging science now that brain is not the only brain in the body. There are gut bacteria in our guts that outnumber human cells by an estimated 10 to 1. So if we're made of trillions of cells, tens of trillions of gut bacteria in our bodies, and on our skin for that matter. They're just kind of all over us. We have this sort of symbiotic relationship with them where they actually confer certain benefits to us. And they can be pathological too if they are imbalanced. The microbiome, the gut bacteria population, play an important role in gut barrier integrity. They synthesize vitamins, short-chain fatty acids, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. They chelate or bind toxins. They aid in nutrient assimilation. So a variety of very important roles. the gut barrier integrity is just critical, because if the lining between the gut, what our body receives as food, and on the border or the opposite end of that wall, as it were, is the internal part of our body, I guess. And what presses up against that gut lining, the first thing we have is this huge part of our immune system. Most of the immune system is actually concentrated around the gut, and that is meant to be a sort of sterile is maybe not the most accurate word, but it's meant to be a very distinct barrier. So the only thing that should cross that barrier are the nutrients that our body wants to absorb from food, whether it be glucose or vitamins and so on. But when you have like little bits, what we refer to as leaky gut syndrome, if the gut is damaged in any way, you have like small, potentially undigested food particles or pieces of bacteria that cross the gut and enter into the bloodstream. And the immune system being right there, the immune system recognizes something as like this is not supposed to be here, and it goes into attack mode, and this can be sometimes precipitate autoimmune conditions. The body starts recognizing that this protein is not supposed to be here, but it also resembles the proteins that are already in my own body, and like there's a sort of wild attack, and it's almost like collateral damage that ensues. And these things are what propagate this immune reaction. So, for example, if you look at lipopolysaccharides, which are a component of gram-negative bacteria in the gut, and that is supposed to be relegated to our gut only. It shouldn't be in the bloodstream. But if you do a blood test and detect it in the blood, you will typically find a very intense immune response along with that. And the other implication is that this is almost a dissertation on its own, but the blood-brain barrier is very similar to the gut immune barrier. And if these inflammatory agents are crossing from the bloodstream into the brain, they set off this inflammation cascade in the brain, which may, in a sense, actually be what autism functionally looks like in the brain. Like the behavior that we observe in autism may be a reflection of inflammation in the brain, and there's some evidence to suggest that. And like, interestingly too, if you look at lipopolysaccharides, they actually use those in animal studies to induce inflammation. And if you inject an animal with LPS into their bloodstream, the inflammation levels go off the charts, and they sometimes will exhibit these autism-like behaviors. So there's a lot of really strong connection. There's also other studies that have looked at how you can do a fecal transplant, which is almost like a purified version of poop, and from one animal to another, and you can almost transfer the behavior of the one mouse to the other mouse. There'll be very distinct behaviors, and you'll do the fecal transplant, but the behavior will transplant along with it. So if one mouse is anxious and the other one is not, the recipient will adopt that anxiety from the anxious mouse, and vice versa. So there's very interesting behavioral effects. And if you look at the role of gut bacteria in synthesizing things like serotonin and gamma aminobutyric acid, these other neurotransmitters, it kind of makes sense. So in terms of the other evidence around the gut-brain axis, as many as around about 85% of, by some studies, estimates of children with autism suffer from constipation. This is actually pretty well known. Another thing is that the severity of autism tends to correlate with the severity of the GI disturbance. There's also some evidence that children born to cesarean section are more likely to develop autism than children born with natural delivery. And then there's a little bit more evidence too that breast versus bottle feeding also alters the microbiome, so that breastfeeding is estimated to be more protective against autism. This is an important place to maybe just highlight that I'm not saying that any of these things cause autism. Correlation does not equal causation. That's just one of those things where there may be an association. So of course, if you're born cesarean and bottle fed, does that mean you get autism? Of course not, but it may be a contributory factor. And I think autism is, from my understanding, is best looked at as maybe one of those like 500-piece jigsaw puzzles. And it takes each of those pieces to make the complete picture. You know, you may get some of the pieces and get some sense of the picture, but you want the whole picture, you got to look at all the pieces. And there's also, just incidentally, a saying in the world of autism that once you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism, which is basically saying that autism seems to have very, very unique, very idiopathic presentations. So it kind of adds to the complexity of this whole riddle. But we're trying to see what we see as underlying common factors, I think, the most common factors. So children with autism seem to have a higher prevalence of leaky gut than controls. So there's ways of measuring intestinal permeability, and some of these have indicated about 37%, which is really high. Children with autism appear to have a very different yeast profile. So yeast is a natural part of our physiology in the gut. It performs certain vital functions. Again, it's a case of imbalance. You know, like we have many, many bacteria, strains of like thousands of strains of bacteria, and actually viruses within our system, both in our gut and in our skin, and they play a role in mediating immune function. They confer various benefits in protecting us from other pathogenic organisms. But when you have a lot of yeast, it may be releasing excessive amounts of ammonia, which is like a neurotoxin, other compounds. There's actually studies that have indicated some people produce so much yeast that they are producing acetaldehyde, which is like a metabolite of alcohol, and they almost actually can fail like a DUI test. Pretty interesting stuff that goes on, like our body actually makes its own alcohol in that case. And then there's also studies on the effectiveness of probiotics on treating anxiety and depression. But if you cut the vagus nerve, so that's via vagotomy, the nerve that connects the gut to the brain, those benefits are annulled. So it seems like the vagus nerve is kind of carrying that line of communication from the gut to the brain. And it's almost like the gut is an extension of the brain. And this is what I was saying about the fecal transplants. They can transfer the associated physiology or psychology between subjects in a reversible manner. Not only mood, but also things like predisposition to weight gain. So the type of bacteria you have can play a really huge role in your physical size, like whether you tend to gain or lose weight. So yeah, this is an area of very interesting emerging research. And then also, if you look at antibiotics such as vancomycin, that actually seems to reduce symptoms of autism, which is really weird because you would think, like, why wouldn't antibiotic treat autism? But that kind of indicates the link between the gut and the brain and behavior. So I also tried to highlight some of this in my study because I think it's important to recognize the benefits of science, but humans don't live in a lab, right? So we live in the real world. And a little bit of a tangent about research, but you can do nice, clean experiments in a laboratory setting and very, very accurately control for cause and effect. But how well those results generalize to the real world is another question, because the real world has like so many moving parts and variables at play. So I think anthropological observations have a lot of value too. It's looking at like how humans have lived consistent with their evolutionary past. And if you look at diets, there's a lot of variation. If you compare the Pima Indians, the Polynesians, the Okinawans, people of Ikaria, the Inuit Eskimos, the Tsimane tribe, I think they're from Bolivia. Wide variation in diet, but one thing in common, they tend to have either very low or no incidence of things like heart disease and dementia and obesity and mood disorders and autism and so on. Like, they just seem to be just generally very healthy. Their life expectancy varies a lot because maybe they're more vulnerable to injury or infection and without good medical treatment. But if they manage to evade those sort of predatory elements, they can typically live very long, healthy lives and be healthy to a very old age. I would say too, I don't think this autism correlation is necessarily a question of food processing. Same goes for like degenerative disease in general. Pellagra is a disease that was first detected and identified back in I think the 1700s when Columbus discovered America, and he took corn back to Europe, and then it was discovered like what a good crop that was. Like it was very hardy and resilient and easy to grow, and it became a subsistence crop for I think mostly poorer people. So for those that became subsistent on corn, the problem is that corn tends to has phytates in it that I think cause reduced absorption of zinc. It's been a while since I looked at that, but I think that's the mechanism what reduces vitamin B6 absorption. So they end up with this deficiency that looks a lot like schizophrenia. And if you think about it, back in the 1700s, even if you were eating a lot of corn, well, it was pure, it was organic, there were no other environmental toxins or air pollution. Air was clean, water was pure, food was pure, everything was legit, organic, and they still develop these sort of intense psychiatric conditions. So it still again speaks to, it's not just about whether food is processed or organic, it's also about the variety of nutrients in that food. And then I'll gloss through this section very quickly just to say, for people that might be looking at like guidance on doing a dissertation a little bit like mine, maybe it will be helpful for you. It doesn't really deal with the autism question per se, but just since it's here. The study that I used, the template, included a statement of the problem, the purpose of the study, the research questions, the grand tour questions, and the significance of the study or the discussion at the end. I chose a qualitative approach. My study was almost like a mixed methods because I was incorporating some data, but the focus wasn't on the data because I only had 10 subjects. And in a quantitative study, 10 is just too small of a number to draw any real meaningful conclusions from. So the quantitative data, meaning the actual number data, was meant more to substantiate and point out in a quantifiable manner, like the descriptive characteristics of change that this physician was getting with her clients, her patients that had autism. So descriptive statistics, as it were, still have a lot of value, or descriptive qualitative data. And it also helps identify areas for future research. I think also qualitative is helpful in that it's really good at looking outlier data that typically doesn't fall under the bell curve of a standard distribution. So, you might look at the mean and you would learn a lot about how children respond to treatment, children with autism. And that's tells you a lot about the average, but it doesn't tell you about those exceptional cases where people went from severe autism to losing their diagnosis of autism. So that's where the qualitative stuff can be really useful in looking at like the unusual cases. And also working with a naturopathic physician was cool because she, as a naturopath, you're trained as an MD, you get medical doctor training. It's just as arduous and rigorous of a degree as an MD. It includes a lot of the same material, and you get additional training in the naturopathic approaches. So it's more integrative in that sense. And now you have a little bit more balance. It's rather than someone that has a blind adherence to one focus or another, whether it's complementary or the standard of care approach. And the methodology, this was the transcendental phenomenological, which is really trying to understand the perspective of another person, which is a big complicated issue. If you do qualitative research, you'll understand this. But it requires the suspension of personal biases, so you can like really step outside of your own worldview and learn to see the world through the eyes of another person. So yeah, I won't go too much into that. If you're doing a dissertation, you probably know about this stuff. There were a lot of ethical considerations here. I was working with the data points were coming from children, so there was, I had to do 2 IRBs basically to get this approved, and they grilled me pretty hard in that one, because it's not only children, but it's vulnerable population, and the practitioner, and so on. So there's all of that. Selection criteria, purpose of sampling, somebody that has uniquely positioned to understand both the biomedical and the sort of naturopathic approaches. She has a lot of experience treating children with autism and collaborates with a variety of providers within the standard of care framework. And she's a licensed physician, so very well qualified. And this was the data collection, a few hours of recorded content, transcribed, specific open-ended questions that would become gradually more specific and eliciting more content. And this is basically the data collection process, and it's a bit of a drag, but it's if you want to look at the slide, if you're doing a dissertation, this will be relevant. If not, skip it. I would just say a quick thing about the reliability and validity of the study. So in quantitative, we're referring to the replicability and accuracy of the measure, respectively. In qualitative, it's slightly different. Reliability is, are you very transparent and thorough with documenting how you did the study? So if somebody tries to do one just like yours, could they expect to get somewhat similar results? With qualitative, it's never identical because every story is unique, but you want to be able to at least be in the same ballpark. And then validity is enhanced by checking for respondent bias, researcher bias, reactivity, triangulation of data, peer debriefing. So I'm basically working with others that kind of scrutinize my work and make sure that it's free of bias. So these were the questions that I presented initially, and they were just meant to be very open-ended, so I wouldn't constrain, as it were, her answers to a specific answer. They were meant to be just very broad and general, and then I would start drilling down further based on the content of her response. You can see those. There they are. I guess I don't need to read them out. But they were meant to just capture some of the broad-ranging experiences. And then these are the themes that emerged, and this is where we start getting into like the sort of qualitative data, was that how she views health as an integrative system, and these different subcategories that I will discuss, what CAM means in practice, and her experience as a CAM practitioner, like in terms of the limitations of the approach, the concerns with the current system, how do we find solutions to all of these problems. The health as an integrative system is a really big one, and I do have a bias towards thinking about health in this way, and systems thinking is something that I really like, and that probably will have to be a lesson topic video on its own. So Dr. Takeda, the physician that I worked with, views autism as having like a variety of etiologies, including methylation anomalies, genetic mutations, stress, anxiety, poor sleep, mitochondrial disease, maternal brain autoantibodies, mercury amalgams in the mother, toxin exposure, and nutrient deficiencies. Mind you, I would say that not only is there evidence supporting these things, but bear in mind that these are things she's actually observed herself in working with her patients. So again, if you look at that in the context of, you might react and say, oh, well, that seems ridiculous, like mercury fillings, like what are you talking about? But that's what I mean about the complexity of autism, and that there seem to be so many contributory factors. And I've personally met people that have had very strong reactions to mercury fillings, and then when they had the fillings removed, their health concern immediately resolved. So just one of those considerations. I know mercury fillings are not typically used these days, but historically they have been. And then another theme that emerged is how she always looks at causes rather than symptoms. So symptoms, of course, sit there on the surface. They're observable. The child may throw tantrums, be irritable, picky eating, constipation, so on. But what's driving those things? And right, you might provide or prescribe a medication like the antipsychotics, like risperidone, to calm that irritable or aggressive behavior, but that's just suppressing a symptom, right? We don't know what's driving it, and that is a key approach to the naturopathic standpoint. And she would always explore, she would do tests. If the tests came back ambiguous, she would test further, and she was saying that she would always find something awry, something was defective in the system, and that would become the target to resolve. So this is interesting because she can, in a sense, afford to do that, because unfortunately and fortunately both at the same time, she's out of network mostly with insurance companies, and I think most of her patients are out of pocket expense. But her sessions are much longer, so a typical physician visit might be 15 minutes. It's really hard to get a lot of historical data from what's bringing the patient to treatment. But her sessions would be an hour and a half, so she could get a lot more biographical data and kind of drill down on what's causing what, and that would help her to kind of identify causes. So that, unfortunately, that's kind of like a limitation of the standard of care model, is that doctors, I think our doctors are typically well-meaning. They're very passionate about what they do and helping people, but this insurance system kind of places these constraints where, like, rapid turnover, and it's a for-profit system, and they have to see, you know, X amount of patients per hour. So it's not ideally effective, I think. I know the intention maybe is cost effectiveness, but the long-term outcomes are I don't think, seemingly very effective. And this detailed, rigorous, slow but sure approach seems much more effective. Dr. Takeda was using this example of eczema, how it might be approached from the standard of care model versus the complementary alternative medical model. You know, eczema is something where you might, if you have the skin disorder, you might be prescribed steroid medication or lotion or something to suppress the inflammation, but a lot of times there are ties that link it back to a gut dysbiosis. Maybe there's a pathogenic gut bacteria, or there's leaky gut, and if you can correct it at that level, you correct all the system's components that link to what ultimately manifests as a skin disorder, and then you correct the entire organism rather than just addressing one symptom. So that's consistent with the cause principles of naturopathic medicine, right? Is trying to identify cause rather than symptom, treat the whole person. And then, as health as an integrative system, the treatment and mechanisms of change seems to be accelerated by targeting causes rather than symptoms. So basically, that the process of identifying the cause may take more time, but once you identify it and work on it, so many other things resolve so much quicker that, you know, children with autism may be in behavioral programs for like 10 years at enormous cost, and not just financial, but the cost on time and the family members and the stress on the child. And if you were to resolve it, if it was indeed a disorder of inflammation and nutrient deficiencies and gut dysbiosis, if you resolve that, it might take 3 months to determine it and maybe another 3 months to treat it, but maybe the child is better after 6 months. You saved 9.5 years and a lot of money. So sometimes just hitting one target will relieve symptoms in seemingly unrelated areas. I don't really have time to go into that, but that's consistent with what the literature supports if you look at things from a systems perspective. And then change often comes about just by removing the offending trigger. I got a typo there, shame on me. As in food allergies or sensitivities. So, like, for example, you'll see this too. Some children respond very well when they remove gluten from the diet. For others, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? Not everyone is a celiac or gluten sensitive. Some people seem to be sensitive to cow's milk. So you have to take this individualistic approach. And then change is often facilitated by targeting gut imbalances, highlighting the system's nature approach to autism. So that was a quote from her that I used, saying that her approach is not like the when children with autism are stimming, right? Like they may be flapping, waving their hands, that she's not trying to squash that. That's a lot of times the target of behavioral modification. It's rather like, let's look at what's causing the stimming and then address that, and the stimming will go away on its own. So much more sensible approach, I think. And then another theme that came up was this idea of restoring balance, which is also consistent with the naturopathic principle. Like, you're looking at nature as healer. So how do we just remove the obstacles to healing? Maybe an oversimplified example is if you cut your finger, no one can really heal that. The body heals itself. You might need an antibiotic to, but you may not even need it if you can clean it out. But if you don't clean it and you kind of rub it in the dirt and leave it dirty and keep using your finger as if it wasn't damaged in some way, of course it's likely to, aggravate the situation, and you're going to foster infection, and you're not allowing the healing to take place. So if you care for the issue properly, the healing is actually mediated by the body. So that's a case of where, like, the doctor, you might go to the doctor and say, I cut my finger, and the doctor's actually not the one doing the healing. They are just trying to move the environment into one that's conducive to healing. And this is the naturopathic approach, is how do we enable nature's healer to take over? And that's, again, like, if you can remove inflammation from the body, then a lot of these systems will resolve on their own. Body has an incredible intelligence of its own. Another thing that she tries to use as much as possible is things, herbal remedies. But being an MD, she is able to use pharmaceuticals when indicated. So she's not, she's not averse to using drugs, but she'll always try to use the least invasive pathway first, so as to, minimize the chance of harm or side effects. So that's more about rather bringing balance, as opposed to thinking about something as good or bad, black and white terms, I guess. The treatment is highly individualized. She works, every patient, I think she would say, she views as their own sort of identity, their own unique person. I think this is also, from my understanding of psychology, very, very similar. Like, you treat the person as an individual and recognize their genetic and cultural and so on, all the unique things that make their presentation unique. Another angle that I also think aligns with psychology is that she looks at things in the system's perspective. So she may treat the child with autism, but the whole family, everyone within that child's circle of care, is considered as part of that treatment team. And that it's a very collaborative approach, and I think that also comports with psychology too. And it's a little bit different sometimes in the medical model, where the patient is the identified patient. Not always, but oftentimes the patient is the identified patient, and the patient is sort of more passive in terms of there's some activity, but they're also a little bit passive about what they do. This is a little bit more active and integrative, I think. And then this is just a quote from her in terms of collaboration, like how she works with other providers. So if we could address the medical piece, and we absolutely still need all of these other therapies. We need psychologists and ABA therapists and occupational therapy and speech therapy and all of these things. I mean, these children need these therapies, but again, my experience has been that when we address the medical side of things, these other therapies become more effective. I've seen so many families where they say, my child was in ABA for 2 years and ABA totally helped some children so much. But there's other families say, my child has been in ABA for 2 or 3 years and we've hardly seen any improvement. And then as soon as we started the medical side of things, their child blossomed, because it's like, wow, their brain is working better. That's a quote from her, and something I've, in my granted less experience than she has, more limited experience, but I've seen this myself. I've seen children that have been in these systems for years, and they're basically not really getting better, despite, I think, the best efforts. I'm not, again, condemning ABA. I think it's beneficial, but it has its limitations too. So it also alludes to the importance of collaborative care, and it's really just trying to look at the system, right? How do we treat the brain, but also treat the body? And then looking also at the role, like the benefits of psychology, and from her model is that she described psychology as incredibly important. It's not only are you trying to correct the health of the child, but if the child loses some aspect of their critical developmental phase, they need to learn how to socialize and learn the meaning of social cues and aphorisms and things like, don't go chasing rainbows. Like, they might literally think, well, why would you chase a rainbow? But they need to learn those sort of basic things at a very fundamental level. And it not only that, but there's also the stress that is placed on family members caring for some children with autism that can be incredibly stressful. How do you support them in being patient with the child and providing an environment that's calm rather than anxious, where anxiety tends to suppress learning? It tends to enhance that fight or flight fear response. You want to really subdue and calm nervous system activity or agitation, which is typically prevalent in autism anyway, and children with autism are especially sensitive to the environment. So how do you create an environment that's fosters growth and acceptance and warmth and love and empathy and so on? And that's where psychology also plays an important role. I think this is my own description, is that maybe it's a little bit like the hardware and software in a computer, is that if you look at a computer that way, if the hardware is damaged, the software is not going to function properly. And you can't really blame the computer, the software, because it just can't run on that system. But even if you correct the hardware, you still need to the hardware in itself is somewhat useless, right? You need to have the correct programming on there, and that needs to be modified in the case of a child with autism according to what their needs are. So the brain, of course, might be the hardware of that process, and then the software is the learning the new and corrected behaviors. So yeah, we're looking at both the inner and the outer environment, and also social interactions. Like children with autism, unfortunately, many times ostracized or cast out by peers, just because children, of course, don't understand. I mean, a lot of adults don't, that autism is different, and helping children with autism to navigate social networks and build friendships, of course, is also very important. Sometimes they have self-esteem issues because they recognize there's something different about themselves depending on their level of functioning, and then that requires its own sort of therapy and reprocessing, cognitive and emotional and behavioral and so on. So in terms of looking at the root cause, this is a quote again from her that she was saying, I think it has that the principles of the teaching, that you're really trying to teach the patient about what it is you need to do to be able to freely address these issues, and helping them to understand how all these things fit together so that they can become an advocate for themselves. So this was a big one because, as I was just saying before, it's not really helpful if the patient is passive or takes a passive approach about their care. You're really ideally trying to teach them how to take charge of their own health and advocate for themselves. And that's about patient empowerment. And then she said, I think ideally how it should work is that the patient is really at the center, and you have all these different practitioners that are meeting, whether it be an oncologist, a dietitian, acupuncturist, psychologist. I think that has a lot of merit because people are experts on their own experience, and no one else knows that experience but them. And if, as providers, as healthcare providers, those of us that are in that role, we need to learn how to listen so we can work with the patient rather than assuming that we know what is best for them. It's meant to be collaborative care. Bear in mind, again, like most of the studies in medicine are based on what you see under the bell curve. It's the statistical mean. What's the average? But the average doesn't account for the people that are on the outliers of that distribution, that are on the 99th percentile or the first percentile. And there you see a lot of differences. And I think the message there is like learning to really recognize and respect what the patient has to say about their own care and empower them to navigate or manage their own health. And at the same time work, be open-minded and work with other providers so you don't think that your way is the highway and it's the best way. So, and then another one of the limitations, and I would say this is almost the sort of political aspect, is that she's not in network with insurance. This naturopathic physician that I worked with, she was sometimes frustrated by that because the insurance companies will say, well, there isn't enough evidence to suggest what you do works. There's actually a lot of evidence, but for whatever reason, again, maybe linking back to the studies and what, your sort of confirmation bias about what you believe works and who's, making those decisions on the insurance companies. And maybe also like somewhat distorted by the fact that there may be complementary alternative providers out there that are using ineffective methods that aren't evidence-based, and then the ones that are effective, they're all being lumped into that same group as like, well, they're doing basically like witchcraft or something weird. And that's unfortunate because her results indicate that her approach is very effective. And the limitation about not being in network with insurance companies means that she cannot reach as many people. Not as many people can access her services. So that's very frustrating. I think she does do some of her own pro bono work or fundraising to help people get those services, but if her type of approach was endorsed and supported by insurance companies, more people could access it. And also, it's just learning what the people in the standard of care medical model learn. They're just there's a lot of information that they're not exposed to. So she was saying that, this is her quote again, I've literally had families where they get an autism diagnosis and, they ask the pediatrician, well, what do I do? And they say, well, nothing. Just make sure you get disability for your child when they're an adult. And that's pretty discouraging that some parents are getting that message. That's again the training. Like if you're trained to believe that there's no treatment for autism, that's probably what you're going to believe unless you go and find out on your own that there are alternatives. So some other experiences that she mentioned, just for the sake again of this was a qualitative dissertation, so I was really trying to cover a lot of angles. If you're doing a dissertation, you might find this useful. If not, maybe skip ahead, but this is just interesting in terms of what she experienced, that occasionally she would experience prejudice from other medical doctors. She was criticized for her work. People would not look at the results, they would just make assumptions about what she did. But she said for the most part people are supportive, so that was encouraging. And then, so I also want to make sure I define the fact that the idea that complementary alternative medicine is not this sort of panacea where it's a utopian ideal. Like, it has its limitations, and that's one of the reasons why she would work with other medical providers, because it's collaborative care and it's likely to be more effective. So one of the limitations of these CAM approaches is, like, if it's a dietary intervention, that transition for a child with autism to go from a preference for processed food to healthy food can be very challenging. They may struggle with certain supplements. It may be more expensive. I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case, but that may be an assumption that healthy food is more expensive than junk food. I can prove that point maybe in another episode someday. Another thing is that she would do this lab work, and that's an out-of-pocket expense that is quite costly. And especially if you do that as a before and after test of effectiveness of treatment. So you kind of, time point A is before treatment and time point B is after treatment, and you compare outcomes. That's great for establishing and documenting the effectiveness of the treatment, but it's limited in that if you're a parent of a child with autism, that testing costs a lot of money, and your child gets better, you don't really want to test them a second time because you achieved the goal, like, they're better. So why spend hundreds of dollars on lab tests to show on paper that they're better? We already know they're better. So it makes it harder for this type of medicine to collect evidence of effectiveness. So yeah, that's one of the limitations. So it's insurance. That's a concern with the current system, right? The insurance has a bias towards the medical model. The costs of ABA can be exorbitant. They can be like over $10,000 a year, or well over $10,000 a year. Even if insurance pays for it, that cost is still falling somewhere. It's inflating the cost of the medical system generally, and then that may equal higher premiums and so on. It's money still. ABA wait lists can be very long. I think here in Hawaii it can be typically 2 or 3 months, even longer, to get ABA services in many instances. The wait list is tough too, because time is precious. When you're not treating a child with autism in those critical developmental years, you're losing time, and time is of the essence. And then, of course, the medication side effects that I alluded to, like, a child. Some of these studies that I looked at with weight gain with these medications were pretty profound, like massive weight gain, many, many pounds within less than a year. And that's concerning because childhood obesity is actually already a concern, like, not from a moral perspective, of course, but just from the physiological concerns that come with it, and the correlation between pretty strong correlation between obesity and other chronic disease states that follow along maybe a decade or two later. So if you're developing that in childhood, it's not a great sort of forecast for your 20s and 30s. And then in terms of what we were looking at as potential solutions for all of these different problems, what she was saying as a physician, a naturopathic physician, is that she thinks continuing medical education would be essential. So don't just stop at the MD, keep going, keep learning, and be exposed to things, elements of CAM, complementary medicine. Fundraising, which she's actively involved in, so she can provide access to care for people that are without insurance or without the funds to get these treatments. Involving families, so that's that sort of systems thinking approach to care. And then just a nice quote from her on how she envisions this sort of medical model of the future, which is that my big long-term vision is that, I really would love to see an integrative clinic where we have all of these different types of modalities and healthcare practitioners that are working to help children with autism. Maybe it's a pie-in-the-sky kind of dream, but my big vision is to have this integrative center for children with autism and special needs. And then there's a pediatrician, a neurologist, a gastroenterologist, a naturopathic doctor, an occupational therapist, speech therapist, psychologist, music therapy, equine therapy, all these other things that we know are beneficial. So very, very, very integrative. And then briefly, just to summarize, this was the quantitative data that I just collapsed into graphs and very briefly summarized. These were the pre and post-test outcomes. So this was going back to the methylation cycle. The S-adenosyl methionine and the S-adenosyl homocysteine have a specific ratio that is optimal. Most of the children were outside of the reference range before treatment, and then you see they had moved quite subtly, but they had moved mostly in the reference range. And then nitrotyrosine is a marker of oxidative stress, so this should be low. The lower the better. And as you can see, these children before treatment, quite elevated levels of this compound, and after treatment these values had declined some quite substantially, indicating that there was more antioxidant defense mechanisms in place via this treatment, maybe increased levels of glutathione and increased other nutrients that help suppress free radical activity. The autism treatment evaluation checklist was the measure that she used to assess behavioral change from before and after intervention, and these are the main domains they assess for, which is speech, sociability, sensory cognitive awareness, and health and physical behavior. So lower scores indicate improvement, and you can see that some of the changes are not that significant, but some are. They all seem to trend in the general direction. Well, no, I shouldn't say all, because some actually they almost seem to be like a slight regression. But again, we don't know the specifics of compliance with the treatment, and if there are other environmental factors that may have been barriers to change. So, but one last slide, which is the overall ATEC score. Again, so lower scores indicate improvement. Two of these were pretty remarkable. Like this is 120 range. That indicates severe autism, and that drop is like at the end of treatment. They barely meet criteria for autism, so it's almost like they lost their diagnosis, whereas others seem to have more modest improvement. But again, just to reiterate, like that's her outcome from a small subset, because she's treated many hundreds of patients. She's seen many hundreds of, well, she said that she's had great improvement with the vast majority of her patients, but she didn't have the data to support that. Like I was saying, you have to get the lab tests, and those cost a lot of money, and you don't have to get them. Like, if your child is better, why keep spending money, So I would say that that's just some reflection of what's possible. It certainly seems positive, and I think, if you could take this as part of the treatment puzzle and combine it in this way that she's talking about, this collaborative care model, this suggests that this method of addressing physiological needs and nutritional deficiencies could be a very effective part of the standard of care model of treating autism. And the best thing maybe perhaps is that correcting these sort of metabolic and biological abnormalities are beneficial in their own right for fostering overall physiological health. And if you do it right, there's no side effect. There's no sort of negative consequence, as it were, for eating a whole foods diet, a diet that's consistent with our sort of evolutionary past, like food that's unprocessed and low in sugar and high in micronutrients and so on. So that's what we probably should be doing anyway. And then another perk is that you get to reduce your dependence and need for pharmaceuticals. You may need them, but you can maybe take a much lower dose. So that would be kind of the goal with this treatment model. So, and then just a summary discussion to recap with the standard of care model, or in the current standard of care model, etiology of autism is typically attributed to genetic, biological, or environmental causes, but factors relating to methylation, nutrition, and the gut-brain axis are seldom referenced in any meaningful detail. Standard therapies are behavioral and medical, such as pharmaceuticals, but the naturopathic approach seeks to understand other possible causes and treat them with an individualized approach. And then amongst the public, there seems to be a lot of confusion. I think the danger of the internet is like the drinking from a fire hydrant analogy. There's just too much information, and it's really hard to sift through what's what. It's potentially dangerous. There's an estimated statistic on how many parents of children with autism try their own thing, such as gluten-free diets, or maybe like certain nutrients, kind of a buckshot approach, and hope for the best. It could go either way, like it might be beneficial and it might not. And if this thing was, a lot of them, they won't tell their pediatrician. So this is where, if pediatricians were trained in complementary alternative medicine, they would be able to guide the patients in the most effective way, honestly, and providing like the most information. And I think that would be safer and more effective. So most chem approaches are safe, but there is some risk. For example, the SAMe, that is an over-the-counter supplement, and there's good science around SAMe that says it has, like, seems like it's quite effective as an antidepressant, for example. If you understand the role of methylation in depression, it makes sense. But on the other hand, just trying it for the sake of trying it is not entirely safe. It can aggravate bipolar disorder. So I wouldn't, like I said, talk to your doctor if you're ever considering trying that stuff, because those are the types of things where you don't want to like play with fire. You don't want to just do it wrong. And then providers within the standard of care system may not think to refer to a licensed naturopath. I think this is a problem I see also in psychology, is that not many psychologists know about naturopathic medicine as an option. So if a psychologist is doing an intake with potentially a child with autism, they're likely to refer to ABA therapy, or maybe therapy with the parents of the child, and maybe a psychiatrist. And because psychologists were not typically taught in grad school about things like methylation and oxidative stress and how nutrients affect the functioning of the brain, if there's no awareness, it's like we don't know what we don't know. So why would you refer to someone that you know nothing about? And this is one of the things I wanted to address in this study and bring awareness to this. And just in terms of like how naturopathic medicine fits in the scope of a Western medical system, it's the way she described it as addressing the medical aspect of things, helping to correct the gut and metabolic disturbances so that the brain can work better. It applies a shift towards systems thinking rather than organ-centric thinking. So looking at the whole system rather than, well, the brain is not working right. No, it's the whole system that we need to address. And then systems thinking also aligns with the holistic approach of one of the principles of naturopathic medicine, which is nature as healer. And then how she derived meaning making. What does this mean, basically, to be a naturopathic practitioner? It seeks to facilitate bringing natural systems into balance, embraces a diversity of approaches and treatments, such as collaborating with other specialties, and it's very holistic in both in terms of how she conceptualizes the etiology and treatment of autism, but also in terms of collaborative care. In terms of the clinical implications of the study, it's really how can the current system of care be improved. I was wondering at times if this is a groupthink error. So medicine's made some mistakes in the past. Like, for example, there's this guy, Ignaz Semmelweis. He was the Hungarian physician who popularized the practice of hand washing years before Louis Pasteur's germ theory proved him correct. So that was predominantly through washing of hands before helping to deliver babies. And when he introduced this practice, the mortality rate for infant death at childbirth plummeted. He virtually eliminated the problem. But because there wasn't really evidence, as it were, to substantiate that, his colleagues ridiculed him and said he was just being superstitious, and he was basically ostracized and cast out of the field of medicine. And he was right. So medicine makes these mistakes. Groupthink error is what happened with the Space Shuttle Challenger, I believe it was, when they all thought, some of them suspected that it wasn't safe to launch, and I think some of them were pushing for it, and they all just kind of like said, okay, well, we'll just go along with it, even though we have our doubts about this being safe. And that was the one where it blew up in takeoff, right? Part of this change process may come down to education, both for current providers and students. I think that would be a really big part of it. We also have an ethical responsibility to both do no harm and provide the best evidence-based treatment. So there's a strong ethical component. If we're not doing the best possible treatment, we're doing a disservice to the patient. And I think also this would also require that CAM providers are operating at a high standard so as not to cast doubt on its validity as a treatment. So there are definitely some CAM practices out there, complementary practices that appear a little bit shady, and unfortunately those reflect poorly on the evidence-based CAM approaches. So just quickly to wrap up the limitations of the study. Of course, you have to include this in a dissertation, and there are valid limitations. It was a single case study, so that means we can't necessarily generalize that to the broader population. There's some things that are generalizable, but certainly not all. It's very case specific. The quantitative data set is very small. There were only 10 subjects. There's no control group. The duration of the treatment was about 3.5 years, so there are so many other factors that may have, enhanced the effectiveness of treatment or may have had a deleterious effect. We just don't know. There's just too many moving parts. That's the limitation of naturalistic study settings. And then I think more information could have been gleaned with more interview time. I noticed for myself a tendency to go into methodological drift, going native. If you're in research, you'll know what I'm talking about there. I won't elaborate on that. And this is student level research. So, I might have been doctoral level research, but that's still somewhat novice level research, to be fair. So that's maybe a limitation. I think in terms of my own personal biases, I may have overestimated the potential value and impact of naturopathic treatments. So I do highly value them, but I think there are definite benefits to the standard of care model as well. So I really kind of welcome the collaborative approach. And then naturopathic medicine has a variety of constraints, kind of some of those of which I discussed. I would say that it's likely neither helpful nor accurate to try to identify a hierarchy of treatment effectiveness. In the spirit of integrative care, the ideal may simply be that of optimizing collaboration, right? Draw from the strengths that each camp has, I would say. And then in terms of recommendations for future studies, I think one consideration is that, randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard in research, especially the double-blinded studies. They come with a whole host of limitations of their own, however, especially when approach is individualized. And I think that is the case with autism. The pharmaceutical model works on a drug that costs a lot of money to develop and hopefully works for most people. And autism seems like it has a different presentation where it has to be individualized. And like I was saying about the complexity of the way food works with its sort of nutritional component, like when you compare quercetin from apple skin versus eating the whole apple, like the whole food seems to be more beneficial, maybe because it's quercetin synergizing with all of the other nutrients such as vitamin C and potassium and other things that are in the apple, and the soluble fiber that has a beneficial effect for the gut bacteria. Those things are like just really hard to study in a lab. You can't really isolate the variable. There's just too many moving parts, and I don't think that randomized control trials are ever going to really, I doubt, give us the answer to autism from the standard of care approach. I think qualitative research with other naturopathic physicians would be interesting, because then they may have differences of opinion and different approaches, but they come from the same sort of model. I think that qualitative studies with children and families who've experienced both sides of those treatments with autism would be interesting to hear what they've experienced, what was effective, what was not. And then studies that compare the pros and the cons and the effectiveness of medication with a nutritional focused treatment would be also very interesting. I don't know if those studies have been done. I don't think I've seen any. And then another approach might be just that the change we envision could come about organically. So it's just sort of gradual. I think the interest in complementary alternative medicine has been growing. The upside of the internet is that the information is more accessible. Maybe recognizing that there are some failures to the pharmaceutical approach. It's kind of like word of mouth. People find out organically, in a sense, about alternative treatments, and that may be an area for future growth and research in this field. So my conclusion was just that I hope that it would present new ideas to enhance collaboration between psychologists and naturopathic doctors, identify and propose solutions for current barriers families of children with autism face in accessing safe and effective CAM treatment, and help to break down some of the barriers that currently appear to be keeping the standard of care and CAM approaches in two separate camps. And this was a thank you to Dr. Takeda, the naturopathic physician who participated in the study, to Dr. Phil Howard, to Dr. Anderson for overseeing this work, and all my friends and family. Tired just like talking about this stuff. I don't recommend dissertations for fun. They're a lot of work. But if any of you, I guess, have family members with autism that haven't received the best treatment, or have received treatment that just didn't yield the results you desired, or if you know people who have children with autism and so on, if you think this information would be helpful to others, please pass it. Feel free to share it, pass it on. If you have comments or questions, post them below. I'll try to answer what I can. I certainly don't present this as like the cure-all, like the solution to what autism is, or any of sort of these neurodevelopmental or neurocognitive disorders, but I do think that there's evidence, there's a lot of these repeating patterns, as it were, of inflammation and oxidative stress and gut dysbiosis and methylation abnormalities across a range of chronic diseases. And I think that's one of the reasons why modern medicine is struggling with these things, is it comes from the model of identifying a specific cause, like a bacteria, and then prescribing a specific antidote, like a antibiotic, right? And with these complex issues, because there are so many moving parts, it's so hard to use a drug approach. And it's hard to use a behavioral approach. I mean, how would you cure scurvy, for example, with a behavioral approach? Like, you couldn't, right? The only thing you can treat scurvy with is vitamin C. There's nothing else. So I think the physiological and the psychological go hand in hand, and it's maybe time for those of us that work in this sort of healthcare sphere to learn to recognize one another's strengths and be open-minded about alternatives when we see that the current treatments are maybe not ideally optimally effective. So if you are able to stick that out and listen to that almost 2-hour-long talk, kudos to you. Thanks for listening. Please, I welcome any feedback and questions and comments. And yeah, next episode hopefully dropping soon. Aloha.